and welcome to the Ideal Spaces podcast, the podcast that celebrates the ideal spaces of yesterday, today and tomorrow. I'm Flora Loughridge, creative director and host of this series, and I'm here with Ulrich Gehmann, the director of Ideal Spaces.
Yes, hello, I'm Ulrich Gehmann and I'm very happy that we have this podcast today in the framework of experiencing space as a general topic.
And it's an incredibly varied and wide-reaching topic because it covers not only the physical built architectural world around us, but also the ideal and imagined spaces. And I think that combination of the real and the virtual will be really key to our discussion in this episode. So I'm delighted to welcome Chris Solarski onto the podcast today. We'll be exploring with him the interactive world of video games and how exactly players are made to feel fully immersed in the virtual environment. Chris started out in video games at Sony Computer Entertainment's London studio as a character and environment artist, before making a career-defining detour into figurative oil painting. His interest in combining game art with classical art resulted in his development of interactive empathy and embodiment, a sensory design approach to interactive media that uses traditional craft techniques to heighten the physical environment and physical experience of gameplay. Chris has authored 2 other books on game art and storytelling in games, which have been endorsed by the likes of Assassin's Creed founding member Stefan Asadorian and Cyberpunk 2077 level designer Max Pears. So without further ado, welcome to the podcast, Chris.
No, thank you very much, Flora. Thank you, Ulrich. It's a pleasure to be here to talk with you about this interesting topic.
So I have to confess, I'm not much of a video gamer myself, but I have always been really interested in the scenery in video games and also how players become so drawn into and a real part of the worlds that they experience. So maybe we could start by thinking about how you first became interested in video games and game design, Chris.
Well, it might be slightly outside the topic of our discussion today, but it was as I was graduating in computer animation, I studied at the University of Portsmouth, and I originally really wanted to get into computer animation, like naively thinking that one day I could work for Pixar or somebody like that. And it was in the last semester where I picked up a copy of Edge magazine, which was then very progressive in the way that it critiqued games. It really took them seriously. And it was the first time that I started to realize, actually, this medium is not just for kids. This is really something that has a lot of potential. And I suddenly did a U-turn and away from computer animation and thought, okay, games is what I want to get into. That became my goal from then on.
I'm intrigued to know a bit more about the types of games you design. Are they mainly figurative or are they based on landscapes?
Well, the first job I had sort of at Sony, I was recruited to work on a football game. So I started off by creating football stadiums. So I was working on the environment team. I mean, this was back when the PlayStation 2 was still around, the PSP was soon to be released. So these were very low detail, low polygon environments, but it involved, of course, like designing the architecture, then texturing, or you can imagine painting the environments and lighting them as well. Then I started to do figurative drawing halfway through my time at Sony. And up until then, I'd really thought that drawing figures was not for me, that I was still, as many people are, sort of thought that I just didn't have the talent. But when I really got into studying figurative art, I naturally just got better and better. And that goes for everybody. It's really down to practice. And I was surprised and very excited to be accepted onto like a gangster game very similar to GTA. It was called Getaway Gangs of London, and there I was doing characters, very low detail, low polygon characters, because these are older consoles that I was working on. But there again, it was designing the characters, texturing them, which is just painting them, and also getting them to animate. So it was sort of making sure that when they go into the game, they deform properly when they're running and doing all the activities while the player is controlling them. And after that, there was this gap of training that I did where I really quit my job and focused on painting and drawing figurative art and learning about composition, all the art fundamentals. And after that, it was working for a very small studio. So it was very different to Sony, where, as often happens for small independent studios, you become very much a generalist. So that's where you start to work on maybe characters one day, environments another. This was for a mobile platform, so comparatively simpler than working on a PlayStation console. But you also, of course, do user experience design. So trying to find a way for the app to feel very comfortable to use for players. And I think those experiences together shaped the kind of work that I'm doing, the more theoretical stuff that you find with, for instance, my interactive empathy and embodiment method. And that one is used by very varied developers. So some people working on, really big multi-million-dollar games to small independent games. So that's what I always wanted to do, sort of try to demonstrate how these classical principles not only are relevant to game design, but also sort of relevant to whatever type of game you're working on, whether it's a console game or some kind of virtual reality experience.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting how those two things actually work hand in hand. They work in parallel. You've got the theoretical side to your work, and then also the more practical side with the drawing. And I imagine it's incredibly exciting when you see your drawing come to life and something you've been working on, piecing together in the studio, actually transforms into this fully immersive, three-dimensional reality for players.
Oh, for sure. It was, still remember how exciting it was. For the first time ever, I was, designed something and I could actually see it running on a PlayStation. We had these development kits at work, so in-house at Sony. And yeah, it was like a super exciting thing for a recent graduate to see, or having your characters run around an actual PlayStation environment. And in general, I mean, this drawing is essential. And I quite frequently teach the game design method, the interactive empathy and embodiment. And I'm very much aware that because of its classical art foundation, it does require game designers to be somewhat more artistic than they might be using more conventional game design methods. And so it is definitely important for me also, through your questions, even to reflect on how all these different experiences that I've had shape how I see game design and interaction design.
And I'm curious about this link you've drawn there between classical art and game design. I mean, if we think about the classical notion of a work of art being some kind of imitation of reality, would you say that video games do something similar in how they capture those dynamics of life and movement? I'd be interested to know, for example, how close you think a video game can get to reality.
Well, that you always have this, currently at least, this abstraction. The input device, such as like a PlayStation controller, just has a very limited tactile, haptic, textural qualities. You have to go through some form of abstraction, just like when you're drawing a still life or drawing a human. The gestures that you make with the pencil and the paper are very far removed from the actual object that you're studying, that you're drawing. That, of course, will change, but this kind of sense of reality can also be discussed from the perspective of the visual fidelity. And I mean, that's improving all the time. But my particular interest is, how do we kind of echo the tactile sensations from reality using existing tools we've inherited from classical art? And I think we can get very close to creating spaces that feel real and the player feels present in them. Then that's something that already exists, I think, aside from the input devices and the graphical quality of games.
That's an interesting aspect. There's the point also of atmosphere. As far as I remember, and I'm no expert in video games, but as far as I remember, the entire discussion about the virtual worlds, presentation of virtual worlds, there has been always addressed also the topic of atmosphere. So is it possible that a virtually created world, which is made on a digital base, as a not handmade as in classical arts, is a digitally created virtual world capable of transferring a kind of atmosphere at all?
Well, the word atmosphere, I suppose, is loaded in the meaning of it is loaded in different ways. But, when you design a video game, when you design a painting or a film, everything has to be selected, even for a live action movie. And, the artist is ideally curating every single aspect of that. And the more effort they put in, the more bigger concepts they begin with, like this holistic approach down to the finer details. Every one of those decisions has the potential to steer the audience's feelings in a particular direction. So from the shape language that you choose to the textural quality of objects and the colors, how close or far the camera is, decisions that the designer might make. This is all an art form that film directors, game directors, everyone is using because they mimic our real life experiences. And I strongly believe it all comes down to this common shared perception of reality that strongly informs how audiences respond to the atmosphere, how it's shaped by the directors. And we definitely can't define it with scientific precision, but we can definitely guide, shepherd the audience in a particular direction, because otherwise every artwork would just be 100% open to personal interpretation, which is definitely not the case. Whichever film you watch, whichever music you listen to, there is a particular angle to the atmosphere that the artist is channeling you down.
I think there's also a very unique element of anticipation there. As a curator, as the artist, you're having to kind of predict how exactly you think the audience or gamer will respond or react to something you will have introduced as part of the design process. Could we maybe pick up on an example to explore that in a bit more detail and see how it actually works from your perspective?
Sure thing. I mean, we could potentially just start with the concept of structural composition in classical painting. So we have the slides that the listeners can refer to, such as slide number 55. For instance, it's an image painted by Raphael, the Renaissance artist. The slide on the left has some cultural content in it, sort of what is the identity of these figures, what is the round circle above their heads, and what is the meaning of the fabric, the costumes that they're wearing, and even the oil paint is sort of like of cultural significance. And by being culturally significant, it also means that it's very subjective, that depending on how close or far away you are to the subject matter, you'll have a different value associated or a completely different understanding of what this image contains. But the structural composition is one that's based on a very circular shape. And this is something that is very much designed. It's something that the artist would have spent weeks or months putting together. And this is a feature of, that we see in games, in film, in advertising images as well, where there is a structure presented on which the content is placed. And the artist already is thinking about the abstract hidden shapes that they want the image to resonate.
Because, of course, the audience isn't necessarily meant to see that circle and to see those shapes. So it's just meant to seem or come across as a cohesive whole that makes sense visually.
Exactly, yes, yeah, and that's why I've kind of broken up these lines as well, because as you say, Flora, exactly that it's deliberately hidden. This is supposed to be beyond the perception of the audience. But if we take that over to something like game design, we have a completely different way that the audience experiences this virtual space. Even a painting is a virtual space. It's like turning a flat static canvas into something that appears to have depth and space. And in this case, of course, just not to ignore the culturally significant triangle sort of in the context of Christianity, but there's also in the Raphael painting, the artist is thinking, what kind of sensations do I want people to have that work on this subliminal level? And in games, we are quite literally animating the player. The audience is moving within the virtual space. They might be abstracted to thumb pushes on a game controller, but you can already start to anticipate, okay, what kind of movements do I want to evoke? Are they going to be very circular and fluid ones? Are they going to be very agitated, angular ones? And that for me is a very powerful way to begin the design process, where you have a narrative or some kind of emotion that you want to evoke. And it's sort of thinking in advance, making these notations. Okay, this is the kind of like gestures I want. And then actually curating elements of the environment, of the whole interactive experience to try to evoke those aesthetic or kinesthetic objectives that you set yourself.
And do you do any kind of research or focus group work during that initial design phase where you're trying to work out what kind of reactions players might have to certain experiences within the game? Or do you just kind of judge that based on this more scientific kinesthetic approach? And could you maybe also explain exactly what the word kinesthetic means?
Sure thing. I'll start with the latter. So kinesthetics is basically aesthetics, or like the visual beauty or sort of like the visual quality of an artwork. But if you add kin to the beginning, it's taking aesthetics into the realm of movement and gestures. So what is the aesthetic quality of movement? The methods that I wrote, the most recent one is that you kindly mentioned in the introduction, interactive empathy and embodiment. For me, it's quite a new field, so I can't say that I've had focus groups sort of work through this in any way. More that I've started to try to document what are the potential ways that we could document such kinesthetic objectives in advance of the process, because all of this is quite new. And the research I took, or the reason why I even called this sensory design, is because this is something that apparently originates from architecture and interior design. Interior designers might use, for instance, Bluetooth devices to see how visitors might use a space and try to anticipate or structure new design solutions around the existing activity, for instance. And thinking about sensory design in the game development process, so like from start to finish, I realized that there's a lot of room to use this way of visualizing kinesthetic movements, potentially through thumbnailing, just like a lot of artists will do studies of busy spaces like a train station or something, and try to use very abstract lines and shapes and this visual notation of movement. We can also use motion capture devices. Also in film, they have some tools where they can map out an environment and then decide on where the camera will move, where actors will move. And all of these allow you to visualize the motion lines that will be tracked by the audience. And I think all the examples I've given, sort of sketching movement in public spaces, using motion tracking, using these kind of planning tools for a live action film shoot, what they do is really this visualizing the motion lines. And this is just like when you're drawing a figure or anything, the line you draw is a record of your physical movement. And this is for me what sensory design is sort of like visualizing the visual quality of lines, which you then want to evoke during the experience.
It's a very interesting aspect, the relation you draw between architecture and movement. And it came into my mind, I had the idea that what if we conceive architecture as a normally conceived as a static, not moving, non-dynamic element? If we conceive architecture as a kind of dynamics, as a kind of movement, and to see architectural structures, for instance, as a kind of frozen movement.
Oh, for sure. If I could maybe just refer you to slide 25. So for the listeners, this slide features 3 logos. One is from Disney, one is from Elle magazine, and one is from Anthrax, a heavy metal band. 3 architectural buildings, which I must admit I don't have the notation here. Sort of they're all in Switzerland. One is a museum based in Bern, another is in Geneva, a new watch building. What it separates them is that the logos, the buildings, and the pathways I've categorized in terms of the line quality or the shape quality. So the Disney logo, what I like to do is often encourage my students to make copies of something like the Disney typeface. And by making a copy, you start to kinesthetically sense what the value of this logo is, and that it's very bouncy and fluid and continuous. And when you look at the Anthrax logo, you can see it's edgier. And by making a copy, putting a pencil down on paper, and really trying to get into those corners, the edgy line quality of that, you start to realize actually this is really evoking a very agitated movement in me, a very agitated kinesthetic sensation.
That's a very interesting example you gave us in terms of these architectures. And this relates to the topic of atmosphere, not to relate movement with atmosphere, with a certain structure.
Yes, yeah, but even just taking the Disney logos, that one is to make a pencil copy of these logos and feel okay. One is very rounded and fluid. One is very linear, vertical, horizontal lines. One very agitated. But I encourage you now or invite you to imagine, what if we 3D printed these logos and you were invited to hold them in your hands? Then of course you would feel the tactile value.
Mm-hmm.
In a very real sense, we can then feel them. And the idea is that this is actually happening while we look at these logos. When you focus on each one of these, your body is responding to this. This is thanks to mirror neurons in our body, which are constantly scanning our environment subconsciously and physically empathizing or responding to what we see. And when we look at architecture is on a completely different scale in most cases. We can stand in front of a building and feel very humbled or sublime in its presence. But this tactile value, I would argue, is still very present. That if we were to create 3D prints of each one of these architectural objects to the scale of something you can hold in your hand, then we would automatically understand maybe how our body is responding to this on a more subconscious level. That architecture, even as a general form, has tactile value. And then we have the opportunity to, of course, enter these spaces and think about how the pathways within those environments are also shaping not only the visual tension, the line of a pathway, whether it's curved or straight or angular, but also, how it's inviting us to move through that space.
That's a very interesting connection also between the tactile qualities, movement, and to conceive architecture as an atmospheric construction in the end.
Yes, yeah, very much. And I can also direct you to slides 34 and 35. So starting with slide 34, this is an interior shot of the Google Dublin headquarters, where they have, you could call it like a chill out area. There's a figure in the foreground reclining on his phone. And so that kind of gives you an idea of how people are expected to use this space, in a very creative, sort of informal way. And when we look at how this space is designed, from the carpets to the ceiling, we see little curving squiggles on the carpet. The carpet itself has a curving pathway that wouldn't look out of place in Hobbiton, in Lord of the Rings. Almost every single piece of furniture has a rounded corner, from the sofas to the plant pots, to the coat hangers, to the lampshades. Even on the windows, there's a frosted print that has curving lines, and even the ceiling fixtures are arranged in a very curving formation. So everything about this space has a tactile quality. Our bodies respond to this thanks to the mirror neurons. We don't have to touch these objects for our bodies to respond to these objects. And this is an experiment that can be experienced or even witnessed through, it's called the body transfer illusion, that we can maybe talk about a bit later on. But just to understand this tactile quality, that our bodies respond to this because they know that a round surface is less likely to be life-threatening in a way. It's a sort of, I would say, a survival instinct mechanism. And I imagine if I invited you all to really just walk through this space, if we had all the listeners today walking in a line through this space and we suddenly entered the scene on slide 35. So this is the Denver Art Museum. And imagine walking through this very colorful space, a very rounded one, and suddenly entering the Denver Art Museum. And even if you just stand there on this balcony, looking down and around this environment, you can perceive the textural value, the tactile value of this space. It's even the banister is sharper. You don't have to touch the banister, but it already has a repelling effect. The angular lines, the exterior looks like a knife embedded in the ground. And so this is what I mean by this tactile value. We don't tend to think of architecture as tactile, partly because of the huge scale. It is affecting our very familiar senses, what it's like to hold a shape. And then it doesn't matter if we inflate it to something 100 times the scale of a person, we still respond to it in that way.
I love that concept of holding a shape, that we do have this subconscious awareness of the spaces, the shapes, and the architectural world around us, but that it happens in such a subtle way that unless they're really extreme and exaggerated and therefore feel very uncomfortable, we don't actually really acknowledge them. I'm intrigued because you mentioned mirror neurons. I'm wondering whether this whole experience could be linked to ASMR, which is that tingling feeling, or how to describe it, I guess a sense of relaxation that you usually associate with certain sounds, like sharp sounds or quiet sounds.
Sure, yes, yeah. But it's, I'm not sure, I can't speak on that topic confidently, but I can relate to this body transfer illusion that I mentioned earlier. We can look at slide 24, for instance, on this topic. This is 2 screenshots from a mini documentary that you can find on YouTube. It's called Is That My Real Hand by National Geographic. There's an actor that put his real hand under this platform on the table. And initially, what they do is that they put a rubber hand on top. So he can only see the rubber hand. His right hand is hidden and he can only see the rubber hand. And they initially just start to brush both hands simultaneously with a paintbrush. So he's getting the physical sensation of the brush on his own hand, but he can also see it happening to the rubber hand. And our brain is remarkable at, I describe it as like a cat, just ready to say, okay, this is not my body, that's my body. Sort of very easy to abandon you in a way, because your mind really starts to very quickly think, okay, the rubber hand is my hand. I can feel the sensation. That is my hand there, even though it's sort of mixing up the sense of feeling and the observation. What these screenshots represent is that they attach the index finger of the right hand to the index finger of the rubber hand. And so every time the actor moves his index finger up, the rubber hand moves up. When he moves it down, the rubber hand moves down. And you can see in the video, the person just can't believe it. He says, this is unreal. I really think that the rubber hand is my hand. Again, this connection between who we think we are and our body is very tentative. That the minute that we focus on a subject, if we're watching a ballet performance, a boxing match, or we're appreciating a piece of architecture, whether it's in a very passive way or very focused way, our body responds on a very subconscious level. It's sort of embodying the aesthetic tension of what we're looking at. And this is what's happening in games. This is what's happening in our environment all the time, except we usually don't sense this. And that's why I tend to show fail videos as a way to heighten the sense of this physical response. By fail videos, I mean, on YouTube, you often see, skateboarders failing or parkour athletes failing when they have an accident. And I sort of run my students through a sequence of these fail videos, and someone falls on their ribs, someone falls on their bum, and the students all realize actually my body is responding to these actions. And I highlight that you're watching this on a video screen. You're not there. So why is your body, why are your muscles, sometimes the same muscles that are being impacted in the fail video, why are they responding when you're looking at this? And it's because your mirror neurons are anticipating and empathizing with what you see.
Yeah. I think there's such a close connection, isn't there, between your feelings and physically how your body responds to those. Like when you've got an exam and you feel incredibly nervous, but you can feel that kind of sitting in the pit of your stomach. So I think seeing something in the outside world that makes you feel a certain way, you do physically have a response to it. It's so interesting and so subtle, but I can imagine incredibly important when it comes to immersing someone in a video game.
Very much so, and especially we can even make it more general, because I do appreciate. I mean, I don't play so many games. That's why it's sometimes good to use film as an example, where either whether you're sitting in a cinema which is completely blacked out and your focus is entirely on the screen, or at home in a darkened out room, you're not so aware of your body anymore. You become the director's camera examining the scene, or you become the actors. Just like in this rubber hand illusion, your physical sensations start to align with that of the subject that you are focused on. When you are playing a video game, this is heightened even more, because as in this slide 24, I've captured these two quite subtle moments, like the finger of the actor is moved up, the rubber hand is moved up. He moves his finger down, the rubber hand moves down. This is sort of a very powerful sense of reinforcement for the brain. That, okay, when I do this action, this rubber hand is moving. Therefore, this rubber hand is my hand. When you're playing a game, exactly the same thing happens. When I move left on the controller, my avatar moves left. When I move right, my avatar moves right. And so very quickly you start to believe, with your focus entirely on the screen, and that you are that avatar, this virtual accumulation of composition of pixels in this virtual world. But whatever that avatar bumps into, or if it moves with very flowing movements or very angular ones, you start to embody those very quickly. They become your gestures and your sensations as well.
And would you say that also relates to this emphasis on physical components, so facial expressions, gestures, posture? I think I read in your work that there's only about 10% given to verbal communication in a game.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. We're very visual people, and so our communication is very very visual focused. And so, I mean, this even comes down to how to teach a class. It's sort of like, if you can visualize everything, rather than add a bullet points, then you're engaging your audience so much more than having them read through a checklist. So when we are playing a video game, especially, it's things like the melodic quality of the music, the shape of the environments and the pathways, just like in architecture. And it's also how the avatar behaves. And by behavior, I mean even things like turn speed. If you can imagine controlling a character that turns with the aesthetic quality of a ship tanker, so very, very slowly, versus one that snaps around, in an instant. You quickly start to embody those gestures. You can't help but align with what your avatar has been curated to behave like. And so all of those come together in a very powerful way. And the important thing is, of course, as designers, thinking about in advance, who do we want our audience to become? What kind of kinesthetic being do we want them to transform into while they are experiencing our interactive game, or while a visitor is visiting our architectural space? What kind of sensations do we want to evoke? And then you sort of think about this, curating this space, the distance between waypoints. What are the pathways like, or even augmenting the space with music? And I know that even shopping malls, when they want you to consume faster, they play faster music. When they want you to take your time, they also slow down the music, and same in restaurants. All of these things come together, in a very primal way to give us a beat to our real life footsteps. We are very obedient in that way. And to make an important note is that as designers and artists, of course, we have to be very conscious of that we have a lot of responsibility when designing these spaces, that knowing how they will affect our audience.
Mm. And we've talked a lot about the designer being the curator, but I wonder, are there ever instances where the audience or the player becomes a co-curator? Because I know in games I've played in the past, you can design your avatar, so you have some kind of control.
Sure. I suppose this is like thinking on two different levels. It is a
Mhm.
good question, because as a designer, I'm always thinking on the holistic level. So, how the whole space is shaped, for instance. And maybe it's a good opportunity for me to point out that I use shape language and structural composition in particular in my work, because it has a mathematical basis as well as a visual one. And games being a mathematical medium, I see it as a very important bridge between mathematics, programming, and the visual side of games.
It's a very interesting connection as a short interruption. Since the Renaissance, so the relation between mathematics and space, and this is one thing. And the other thing is what you mentioned between the emotional and tactile component of space.
Yes, exactly. And it's something I definitely want to come back to as well with the scale of buildings, that I have an example, maybe not a visual one in the slides, but for sure, it's a good question, Ulrich. I will just try to answer Flora's question about this player generated content and the balance between that and the designers. That as a designer, of course, you are still curating the overall look of the game. So if you, for instance, if you had a game based on The Simpsons, and one based on, let's say, Game of Thrones, for instance, a slightly more realistic look, there would never be an instance that you could create, say, for instance, the example you gave, Flora, with the character creation tool. The one in The Simpsons would always have these kind of like a tendency towards yellow and blues. It would have very rounded shapes. There would be a quality of eyes that would have been pre-selected by the designers. And then, of course, the players can choose in this hypothetical game, what kind of character they want to design, but every element that they are allowed to play with has to still be coherent within the world of the Simpsons universe. And if you switch to the Game of Thrones, again, there's this realism, there's gritty realism, maybe sort of, yeah, furs, sharp shapes, kind of like from the hunting and stuff like that, leather for the clothing, and the haircuts and everything. And that there also has to be a lot of pre-work gone into that character creation tool, so players do enjoy the customization part, but everything you do has to still be coherent. Give players the opportunity to be creative, but still within the confines of your specifically curated space.
That is also a very interesting notion, this confinement, as in a positive sense of confinement. In classical terms, it has been related to the issue of style, that the worlds, for instance, painted worlds, have to appear in a certain style. And what Nietzsche, the philosopher Nietzsche, said about style, a certain culture you can recognize in its unity of style. No?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that this is a very important relation you mentioned, as it is this consistency, which acts as a confinement in a stylish way. In classical terms, you would have said in a stylish way, but it's a confinement enabling a richness of expression at the same time.
Exactly, yes, yeah, and games are so advanced now, and do readily borrow from existing culture and history. So we have examples like the Blood Elves in World of Warcraft, and that you can see that they reference the Art Nouveau style, and it's just the quality of the lines, these organic forms. And then you have games like Bloodborne, which are very heavily embedded in the Gothic art
Mm.
style, and each one of these has an art style that is selected for its textural value. Gothic, of course, evokes already kind of like a dark, brooding atmosphere, but on a textural quality, it's very edgy and sharp, which is what a game like Bloodborne, which is all about killing monsters, wants to evoke. So the environment works together with this style. And again, it's you as a designer, you have to curate that. And if there is ever an opportunity for players to play like Lego within your universe, I don't know any instance where they're completely free to do what they want. There's always a structure that has been predefined and curated in some way so that it's whatever is produced is still essentially part of that universe.
No, it's really interesting, this idea also of the craft of game design being timeless. There can be all these modern twists on it, and obviously new technology will push it forward in a very different way, but that it harks back to like Gothic times, or the Raphael we were looking at the beginning, those geometric forms, even if you might not notice them as a player or audience.
Exactly, and it is really timeless. That's why I often say, that games are an evolution in art history. They are not a revolution. They look fantastic and so different to anything else that we've experienced before. But we just have to think about, how does the player change the craft? And the fact that the player is inputting part of the composition in a way. They're sitting in front of the TV with a controller in their hand, but they do have an influence on it. So how do we integrate that into traditional craft? And then we can instantly relate all the knowledge that we've accumulated as a civilization, as humans, sort of like through all the artistic movements and cultures that have come before, and realize, okay, it's not that different. We can evoke extremely powerful tactile and kinesthetic experiences like never before. But the tools we are using are surprisingly familiar to anyone that's designed, worked in architecture or in film or landscape gardening or something like that. And even to the point that I didn't want to miss the opportunity to remark on your comment, Ulrich, about mathematics and space. And illustration that I often use, and unfortunately it's not in the slides, but I often use two contrasting games. One game has very tall buildings and skyscrapers in it, and another is this kind of like Farmville style game where the buildings are just a little cube, and you could say they look kind of cute. And this is very similar to, like concepts related to how Greek columns were designed, with a very human-like relationship to them as well, where when we look at these games, one definitively feels like the target audience in a way is going to be an older player, and the other one is aimed at kids or just a playful atmosphere. And this is because when we look at these buildings, we are relating them to these real life proportions in a way, like, how tall is a child? It's like 3 or 4 heads in height. How tall is an adult? 7.5 or 8 heads in height. And all of these kind of mathematical formulas or structures are very much related to, again, to our real life experiences. When we appreciate art, it is a reflection or it questions our reality. It always comes back to that.
Mhm. I had the association to conceive architecture, painted architecture, physical architecture, no matter which one, in relation to this tactile dimension inherent to it, to conceive architecture as a kind of moving sculpture. So if we would carve out movement in a sculptural way, for instance, as we have it for comparison in this Henry Moore sculptures or in classical Greek sculptures, to capture movement in sculpture and then to conceive architecture as a kind of moving sculpture. This was the impression I had.
Oh, very much so. And, like you could imagine potentially a sculpture like the Henry Moore sculptures being maybe a final form that represents an accumulation of observations over time. And of course, like an architectural sculpture as well could be thought of in exactly the same way through this lens. We can always approach the analysis of art and design through different lenses, and each one of those would be valid in that context. And but for sure, it's very much the same. And I think to bring it back to the kind of work that I do, it's just imagining if you tracked the visitors of an architectural space and tracked where they moved, how they turned around, how quickly, how long they stayed in spaces, and created a three-dimensional visualization of this. This is what's happening in games all the time. There are tools that visualize this movement, and this is the art of games, I would say. This is the essence of interactive experiences, because it visualizes the kinesthetic space by tracking player movement. This is especially because games are about interactivity. If you remove interactivity, then it's not a game anymore. This is what is the unique quality of it, and why I focus on this in particular. But in architecture too, you are manipulating the movement of the audience, and sort of if you take this visualization of their movements and hide the architectural object, that in itself is a fascinating sculpture. There's this kind of wireframe, these lines of people moving around the space is going to be like a fingerprint for each building, you could imagine.
And it'd be interesting to track that over time as well. If a lift was out of order and people had to use a staircase, or, you put an artwork in the middle of the room, how that would then alter these patterns.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. And that's exactly the kind of work that I do, that you can, in a sense, analyze existing patterns, kinesthetic patterns of people experiencing a space, from broader movements to, I don't know technically how, but, even like working at a desk. And then, think actually, what is the movement that we would like to evoke? How might the existing visual and kinesthetic value be affecting the emotions of the occupants of that space? How might we want to affect that in a more positive or more formal way, depending on the objectives?
Mm. Do you think then the future of gaming will be about refining those patterns and movements, or do you think there are some major advances and changes that will occur as technology continues to develop?
No, from the work that I do, I think that we already have all the tools we need.
Mm.
I think it's just a shift in focus that has to occur, that when we talk about games, still the majority of people that image conjures up for people is something for play, something that's competitive, that you have to beat someone to win, or they have to master rules to, become skilled and sort of defeat the game and reach an objective. And that's slowly shifting now to the point that even the word video game becomes somewhat awkward to use, because we are seeing games that have no competitive elements at all. They are just about having an interactive aesthetic experience that you can pass through, and it sort of generates ideas and feelings and sensations. And so this definition of video games is being stretched very dramatically, and it's kind of makes it hard to think, sort of even kind of critique sometimes games, because it's such a big industry. It's bigger than film and game and music combined. It makes way more money. And when you look at these games, they are so technically sophisticated, have such huge followings. But we're not at the golden age of games yet. It's when games start to think about, what is the empathy behind the experience, when we start to focus on that and move away from this formal objective, to win, to beat the game, which exists because games, do come from sports and they do come from board games. When we move away from that and start to think, actually, what are the emotions, the same emotions that we love to experience in films and music, when they become the focus, that I think is what my work is striving to enable, more people to understand, actually, this is really important. And so when that happens, I mean, just to make sure, because I appreciate that some of the listeners may not have played any games at all, that, typical high-end game that states that it's very narrative driven will still often have these formal objectives that you have to beat something. And they often weave in narratives which give the impression that there's like some meaningful, quiet, somber narrative in there somewhere, but they do this through these non-interactive animated cutscenes. So you play for a bit, shooting, killing, jumping, and then they have like this non-interactive cutscene, and then you sort of watch basically a film. And then you feel, oh, I feel the sensitivity of the character, and then the animation stops, and you go fighting, shooting, driving again. And this is just to highlight that we often say, games create these very meaningful experiences, but there's still a lot that can be done where we embed those meaningful moments that are now currently exist purely in the non-interactive animation, when we start putting them into the gameplay, so that each game has emotionally varied value. So it's not just about shooting and then you have the emotional cutscene animation, but you actually have potentially aggressive conflict contrasted by sensitive, meaningful moments, somber moments, quiet moments, but all of that happens in the game. And there are a lot of technical reasons, established expectations that prevent big studios from doing that. But there are quite a few indie game studios that are already breaking ground in this area.
And actually, I think having those moments of reflection and that other kind of more feeling side of it is really important, because video games get a lot of criticism because of the violent content. When you were talking about this non-interactive element, I was just reminded of going to a primary school where they had virtual reality devices that allowed the children to create their own houses and then actually go into the houses and experience what it was like in the house that they built. I think that's really important as well, the creativity to maybe counteract some of those things.
Yeah, and that's the great thing, that it's almost like kind of harking back to this Raphael painting where we have this structural composition embedded within the painting, and then Raphael has made sure it's generated by him placing a limb or a fabric or a contour or a shadow to evoke that shape on a very subliminal level. So the audience is never familiar with that. And with this example that you just gave, Flora, the kids going into these spaces, they feel so empowered, and the idea that they can create something and then enter it and explore it is fascinating for everybody. And as designers, we still have that opportunity, just like the character creation tool that you mentioned earlier, that we can still create those spaces. What kind of building blocks, what kind of Lego bricks, so to speak, do we give them the opportunity to play with? We can decide. And it's not by coincidence that games and animations and kids' toys and kids' spaces have very curved corners. To make a space child safe, you put rounded corners on sharp tabletops and things like that. This is because of the something sharp that a kid can hurt themselves on. And when we create virtual spaces, this is the same thing. They look friendlier. The tactile value of these spaces has the same value despite them being virtual or have like no substance whatsoever. And we need to have this holistic understanding that our reality informs virtual spaces and architectural spaces in a very powerful way. We can't separate the two.
And the potential, I think, for interactive media is just off the scale. I think it's fantastic. And it's been really interesting to get your perspective on that as well, from the designer's point of view, because I've played a few games in the past, but I have never kind of had the insight into what it actually entails. And this idea of the tactile sensory experience, I find very, very interesting.
Yeah. It could be very interesting, it's an indirect question, to make a common focus group or kind of research on this very issue of an ideal space, and what could be properties of an ideal space as a space experience. There's no gaming space. You have to do just nothing in this kind of space as a visitor, but just walking around and experiencing the qualities of the space, also the symbolic meanings of its objects, its proportions. And this could be very, very interesting to combine it with movement, also not to see a space as in a traditional way, just as an image, a picture, for instance. And then I conceive a space as a kind of fixed structure, as a kind of standstill. And I have to imagine as a viewer what could happen inside this space. But if you would go one step further, so in this sculpture and architecture direction and this tactile dimension, this indirect tactility inherent to a painted space, and would endorse it with the quality of movement, that you would have the possibility, as in a video game, to move around, but by moving around not having to do something, also to attain some objectives and to solve some problems, but just wandering around and experience the space as space.
Yes, yeah, and I mean, even just the word ideal. For me, like, I use shape language a lot. So the shape language can be reduced to the circle, square, and triangle. And I use these because they're sort of like a benchmark for aesthetic qualities, that the spherical shapes have a very different tactile and visual tension to a triangle. Whether you hold that shape in your hand or try to push it along or visualize it. At least in my research, I found that all of this usually comes down to why nature has evolved certain shapes for certain things is usually for efficiency. Like a canine tooth is triangular because it's efficient at cutting through meat. If you change that shape, the functionality no longer works. It becomes inefficient. It's why we have the golden ratio in nature, and how nature grows is because it's efficient. It uses the least amount of energy. Why, aerodynamic shapes have a curving quality. Nature is evolved to use as little energy as possible. And so when we think of ideal spaces, again, it depends on the context, but there's always this sense of this efficiency, which also relates in some ways to style and elegance. Reducing something to its simplest, to its essence, is often like to make the biggest statements with the least amount of energy. And that actually takes a lot of hard work to do, but that's what distinguishes the professionals from the amateurs. It's this continued interrogation of your subject, of the thing you're designing, to kind of eliminate everything which is not helping, and to sort of find the essence of like the movement. And the context is of course very much important.
Yeah. Because in a way, these are also, in a positive sense, classical aspects about art, proportion, and conception in general. And what I would be interested in is to dynamize an ideal space, to make it a moving entity in the sense also of evolving certain qualities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and for that, I mean, I do have a slide that is very relevant that I could have picked up on earlier. It's slide 99. Ubisoft is one of the biggest developers of games in the world, and they use something called the DNA tracking system. So this slide features, for our listeners, just a map of lines that show the motion lines of players exploring a video game, in this case, Assassin's Creed 3. And what's fascinating about this is that this again is the art of games for me. This is the kinesthetic movement, and each space will evoke different sensations based on how it's mapped and the objectives that the player has to complete within them. This is very strongly curated in advance. But once the game is played, and played by millions of people potentially, it's amazing how consistent the movement is. Like you could say 90% of players do almost exactly the same thing. It seems to be that they have freedom of movement, but if you are a skilled designer, the kind of shepherding you do is with amazing precision. And it's giving the illusion of freedom, but actually curating with very powerful visual and sensory tools what the player will do. And so this is the kind of thing that I had in mind for motion tracking spaces. And it's not original for sure. I know that architects and researchers already do these kind of things, but this just to show you this example in the context of games. And it's kind of related also, or maybe switching topics slightly. Slide number 103. Here we have a quote from Walt Disney, who also highlighted that at first the cartoon medium was just a novelty, but it never really began to hit until we had more than tricks. You have to have pathos or empathy in the thing. And again, this is something that even architects, I'm sure, can take away from this a lot, but especially game designers, because I could rewrite this sentence in the context of games, and it would be at first the video game medium was just about objectives and winning conditions, but it never really began to hit until we had more than these gameplay devices. You have to have empathy in the thing, and so this is like a symptom of every new medium, where at first people are fascinated by the technology and by making things look more realistic and more exciting. But in the end, it always comes but down to, people want to experience empathy and meaningful storytelling. And putting this first is a very important tool for these ideal spaces as well. We're thinking about not even what it's going to look like, but maybe what is it going to feel like before we even place a visual mark on the form.
That is a very important point.
It's so refreshing to hear you speak about the importance of a story and place and empathy all wrapped up in game design. I think that would be a good positive way of ending our discussion today. I'll be putting all the slides in the show notes below so that our listeners can have a look at the images you referred to today, Chris. To all the listeners, I do encourage you to visit Chris's website, Solarski Studio, where you can find out more about interactive empathy and embodiment. And thank you again, Chris, for joining us and introducing Ulrich and I to the world of gaming.
Thank you very much. It was wonderful chatting with you both, and I look forward to any potential collaborations that we can have in future. It's an interesting mix of mixing things between the digital gaming world and sort of more established art forms, for sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
And one final note, if you've enjoyed today's episode, please do subscribe to the Ideal Spaces podcast. Alternatively, you can leave us a review in the comments section below. Thanks again, and see you all next time.